At 18, Ethan Carter owned everything he had left in the world inside a worn-out backpack. The foster care system had done what it always did. On his birthday, he was handed a folder of paperwork, wished good luck, and sent out into the world with nowhere to go. His old pickup truck barely ran, his wallet held less than $50, and he had no family waiting for him, no college to attend, and no place he could honestly call home. 3 days later, a lawyer called with news that made no sense. A grandfather Ethan had never met had left him a piece of property deep inside the wilderness, a forgotten ranger cabin surrounded by miles of forest. According to the old deed, the cabin had been bought more than 50 years earlier for just $200. Most people would have laughed and walked away. Ethan couldn't afford to, with no roof over his head. Even a collapsing cabin in the middle of nowhere sounded better than sleeping in his truck. When he finally arrived, the place looked exactly as everyone had warned him. The roof sagged under decades of snow and rain. Broken windows stared into the trees. The porch leaned so badly, it looked ready to collapse with a single step. The nearest neighbor was miles away. Even the locals shook their heads. "Sell it," one man told him. "That old cabin has never been worth anything." Another laughed. "Your grandfather wasted $200 on that place. Don't make the same mistake." For a moment, Ethan almost believed them. But on his very first night, while trying to nail a loose board across the front doorway before the temperature dropped, his hammer struck something hidden beneath the weathered timber. It wasn't wood. It wasn't stone. It was something no one had seen for decades. And what Ethan discovered next would reveal the real reason his grandfather had held on to that forgotten cabin for the rest of his life. Before we uncover that mystery together, I'd love to know where you're listening from today. What city or country are you in? And what time is it there right now? Leave a comment below so I can see how far this story has traveled around the world. Whether you're starting your morning, winding down after a long day, or listening before bed, I hope you're having a wonderful day and that this story keeps you company. And if you enjoy heartfelt mysteries about forgotten places, hidden family legacies, and second chances, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next adventure. Now, let's go back to the morning Ethan Carter lost everything and unknowingly stepped onto the piece of land that would change his life forever. Text. Ethan Carter had spent most of his life counting the days until someone told him where he belonged. That day never came. On the morning of his 18th birthday, the foster care office handed him a small envelope containing his final documents, wished him good luck, and quietly closed the chapter they had been responsible for since he was 6 years old. Everything he owned fit inside a faded backpack resting on the passenger seat of a rusted pickup truck that coughed every time he turned the key. Less than $50 remained in his wallet after filling the gas tank halfway. College was impossible. Renting even the smallest apartment was out of reach. By sunset, he officially had nowhere to live. He drove until the roads grew empty, finally parking beside an abandoned rest stop where truck engines echoed through the night. Sleep came in short bursts as cold air slipped through the cracked window. The next morning, his phone rang from an unfamiliar number. A lawyer introduced himself and asked if Ethan Carter was available to discuss an inheritance. Ethan almost laughed before explaining they probably had the wrong person. The lawyer calmly confirmed his full name and date of birth before mentioning a grandfather Ethan had never known existed. The man had recently passed away, leaving Ethan as his only surviving heir. There wasn't much, the lawyer admitted. No savings, no investments, just an old ranger cabin deep inside the national forest, purchased decades earlier for $200. Ethan stared through the dusty windshield without speaking. $200. Even 50 years ago, it didn't sound like much. The lawyer offered to meet that afternoon with the paperwork. Having nowhere else to go, Ethan accepted. The office occupied a modest brick building near the county courthouse. Inside, faded maps decorated the walls, and stacks of aging files filled wooden shelves. The lawyer slid a worn folder across the desk. Inside rested a yellowed property deed showing the purchase price, $200. The cabin had belonged to Ethan's grandfather ever since. "I'm afraid that's all there is," the lawyer said kindly. "No debts attached, just the land and the structure." Ethan signed the documents with a borrowed pen. Owning a collapsing cabin sounded ridiculous, but it was still more than he'd owned that morning. Using directions scribbled on the back of an envelope, he drove for nearly 2 hours before pavement gave way to gravel, and gravel faded into a narrow forest road. Towering pines surrounded him until the trees finally opened onto a clearing. The cabin stood exactly where the lawyer had described. Time had not been gentle. Weathered boards had turned gray. Several windows were broken. One corner of the porch leaned noticeably lower than the rest. Moss climbed across the stone chimney, and weeds reached almost to the steps. Still, it had 4 walls and a roof. That alone felt strangely comforting. As Ethan unloaded his backpack, an elderly man driving an old pickup slowed near the entrance rows. He leaned out his window and looked toward the cabin before looking back at Ethan. "You the new owner?" he called. Ethan nodded. The man chuckled softly. "If I were you, I'd sell it. That place has never been worth anything." He tipped his hat and continued down the road. Later that afternoon, another local stopped while hauling firewood. She offered a polite smile before shaking her head. "Your grandfather was stubborn," she said. "Most folks never understood why he kept this place." She wished Ethan luck and drove away, leaving the clearing silent once again. As evening settled over the forest, Ethan gathered fallen branches and found an old hammer inside a cabinet that somehow remained standing. The front door hung crooked, leaving a wide gap where cold night air would pour inside. He searched for loose boards and carefully positioned one across the damaged frame. It wasn't much of a repair, but it might help until morning. He raised the hammer and drove the first nail into place. The second struck cleanly. On the third swing, the hammer hit something hidden beneath the weathered wood. The sound wasn't the dull crack of old timber. It rang with a sharp, metallic echo that didn't belong inside an ordinary cabin. Ethan froze, lowering the hammer as the forest fell completely silent. Text. Morning light revealed little that darkness had hidden. The cabin looked just as worn, its roof sagging under years of neglect, and its walls scarred by countless winters. Ethan stood on the porch, holding the old hammer from the night before. He examined the loose board where the strange metallic sound had come from. Carefully prying it away, he discovered only an old strip of rusted metal reinforcing the doorframe. Whatever had produced the sharp echo was buried deeper than he could reach without taking the entrance apart. For now, staying warm mattered more than satisfying his curiosity. He spent the next several hours making the cabin livable. Broken glass was swept into a bucket. Rotten boards were stacked outside for firewood. Dust covered nearly every surface, and spiders had claimed corners untouched for years. The work was slow, but each small improvement made the place feel a little less abandoned. Around midday, the distant rumble of an engine broke the silence. An older woman stepped out of a faded green truck carrying a small basket. Her gray hair was tucked beneath a worn ranger cap, and she moved with the confidence of someone who had spent most of her life outdoors. "You must be Ethan," she said with a gentle smile. "I'm Grace Holloway. I live a few miles east." Ethan thanked her for stopping by. Grace handed him the basket containing fresh bread, apples, and a jar of homemade preserves. Everyone deserves a decent meal on their first day, she said. They sat on the porch while Ethan explained how unexpectedly he had inherited the property. Grace listened quietly before looking across the clearing toward the surrounding forest. "Your grandfather was a good man," she said. "He understood these woods better than anyone." Ethan admitted he had never met him. Grace nodded without surprise. "Life has a way of separating families, but your grandfather never stopped looking after this place." Before Ethan could ask what she meant, another pickup truck rolled into the clearing. This one was newer, polished, and carried the logo of Sloan Timber Company on its doors. A well-dressed man climbed out, introducing himself as Victor Sloan. He glanced around the property with practiced eyes before smiling politely. "I heard the cabin finally changed hands," he said. "Congratulations." Ethan thanked him cautiously. Victor wasted little time. "Truth is, this cabin isn't worth the trouble. Repairs alone will cost more than it's ever been worth." He reached into his jacket and removed a business card. "I'd be willing to buy it today. Cash. Save you the headache." Ethan looked at the card but didn't take it. "I only got here yesterday." Victor smiled again. "Exactly. Best time to sell before you spend money fixing a place nobody wants." Grace remained silent until Victor returned to his truck. Only after he drove away did she speak. "Don't rush into any decisions." Ethan noticed the seriousness in her voice. "Do you think he's offering a fair price?" Grace shook her head slowly. "I think your grandfather had reasons for keeping this cabin. You should learn those reasons before signing anything." After she left, Ethan continued cleaning. Most cabinets were empty except for cracked dishes and rusted tools. In a bedroom closet, he found an old wooden chest covered with dust. The lock had long since broken, allowing the lid to open with little effort. Inside lay neatly folded ranger uniforms, several black and white photographs, and a weathered leather journal. Ethan carried the journal outside into the afternoon sunlight. The first pages contained daily notes about weather, wildlife sightings, and trail repairs written in careful handwriting. Several entries mentioned lonely patrols through the surrounding hills. Then Ethan noticed something strange. Entire pages had been torn out cleanly, leaving only jagged edges behind. Whoever removed them had done so deliberately. Continuing farther, one sentence appeared again and again in different entries, always underlined. "Never forget the Western Line." No explanation followed. Near the back of the journal, more pages were missing. Ethan closed the cover, wondering why someone would remove only certain parts while leaving the rest untouched. As evening approached, he decided to walk around the cabin before dark. The clearing stretched farther than he had realized. Near the edge of the trees, half hidden beneath moss and tall grass, something caught his attention. Kneeling beside it, Ethan brushed away layers of dirt until the flat top of a weathered stone emerged. Unlike the rocks scattered naturally throughout the forest, this one had straight edges and a shallow carved mark worn smooth by time. It looked as though someone had placed it there on purpose. Ethan rested his hand on the cold surface, realizing this was no ordinary stone. Text ID equals, quote, C7F91K, quote. Ethan remained beside the weathered stone until the fading light forced him back to the cabin. He slept little that night. The carved mark on the flat surface stayed in his thoughts, along with the repeated words from his grandfather's journal. "Never forget the Western Line." At sunrise, he returned with a shovel and carefully cleared away the remaining moss around the stone. It stood upright rather than lying naturally on the ground, its squared edges too deliberate to be part of the landscape. Near its base, he uncovered another faint carving that resembled the letter R inside a circle. It meant nothing to him. After taking a few photographs with his phone, he drove toward the nearest ranger station, hoping someone there might recognize it. The small office sat near the entrance to the forest. Inside, maps covered one wall while radios crackled quietly behind a reception desk. A ranger about 35 years old introduced himself as Noah Briggs. Ethan explained that he had recently inherited an old cabin and showed him the photographs. Noah studied the images for several seconds before looking up with interest. "That's an old survey marker," he said. "They were used decades ago to mark property lines and forest boundaries." Ethan mentioned the journal and the repeated reference to the western line. Noah smiled politely. Old rangers often left notes like that. Survey markers helped define official boundaries before modern GPS. He offered to stop by the cabin after finishing his afternoon patrol. Ethan thanked him and returned home. True to his word, Noah arrived a few hours later carrying a folded topographic map and a handheld compass. Together they walked to the stone. Noah compared the carving with symbols printed on the map before pacing carefully through the clearing. After several measurements, his expression became thoughtful. "That's strange," he said quietly. "According to today's maps, this marker shouldn't be here." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Noah unfolded the map across the hood of his truck. "If the current survey is correct, the property line should run about 40 yards east of this point." He looked back toward the stone. Either the marker was moved or the maps changed. Ethan glanced across the trees. "Which seems more likely?" Noah hesitated. "I honestly don't know." They searched the surrounding area together, following what Noah believed should have been the old boundary. Before long, another stone marker appeared beneath fallen leaves. Unlike the first one, this marker leaned heavily to one side, as though it had been disturbed years earlier. Noah brushed away dirt and nodded. "This one lines up with the first." He stood and looked again at the official map. "But neither lines up with this." Ethan felt the same uneasy curiosity that had grown since finding the journal. Something didn't fit. Before leaving, Noah advised him not to disturb the markers. "They're part of the property's history," he said. "I'll see if I can locate older survey records." Ethan appreciated the offer. It was the first encouraging conversation he had shared since arriving. After Noah drove away, Ethan continued exploring the edge of the property. The farther west he walked, the older the forest seemed. Massive pines towered overhead, their trunks marked by generations of storms. On one tree, barely visible beneath thick bark, he noticed a faded streak of bright orange paint. Curious, he searched nearby and found another mark on a second tree. The paint had nearly disappeared, but the color remained recognizable. Survey paint. Noah had mentioned that crews often marked temporary lines while measuring land. Ethan followed the scattered marks until they vanished beneath decades of growth. Back inside the cabin, he opened the journal again. This time he paid closer attention to entries written during the final years of his grandfather's life. Many described ordinary ranger duties, but one passage immediately caught his attention. The handwriting pressed deeply into the page, as though written with unusual determination. "If they move the markers, the forest will disappear." Ethan read the sentence twice. There was no explanation beneath it. The next page had been torn away. He searched the journal for clues but found only another missing section. Frustrated, he closed the cover and stared through the dusty window toward the western trees. Late that afternoon, the distant growl of engines echoed through the forest. Ethan stepped outside just as two pickup trucks bearing Sloan Timber Company logos rolled slowly along the dirt road beside his property. Several workers climbed out carrying measuring poles. One man crossed onto the edge of Ethan's land without asking permission and began examining the trees. Ethan walked toward him. "Can I help you?" The worker looked uncomfortable before lowering his equipment. "Just checking the line," he muttered. Moments later, Victor Sloan stepped from the second trunk, wearing the same calm smile Ethan remembered. "Nothing to worry about," Victor called. "Routine measurements." Ethan folded his arms. "This is private property now." Victor nodded politely, then motioned for his crew to leave. Of course, didn't mean to cause concern. Within minutes, the trucks disappeared down the road. Yet Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Victor's visit had not been accidental. As evening settled once more over the clearing, Ethan decided to walk beyond the second survey marker Noah had found earlier. Fallen branches covered the ground after an old storm, forcing him to climb carefully over several rotting logs. Near the base of an enormous pine, something reflected the last rays of sunlight. He knelt and pulled away years of leaves and damp soil. Beneath them rested the corner of a rusted metal box buried beside the roots. Ethan dug the rusted metal box from the roots with his bare hands first, then with the edge of the old shovel once the soil hardened around it. The box was smaller than he expected, about the length of his forearm, its corners eaten by rust and its latch nearly sealed shut. He carried it back to the cabin as dusk settled between the trees, placing it on the kitchen table beneath the weak glow of a battery lantern. For several minutes, he only stared at it. The day had already given him enough questions markers in the wrong place. Survey paint fading into old bark. Victor Sloan's workers crossing his land as if they had a right to it. Now this. He found a flat screwdriver in a drawer and worked it beneath the latch until the metal finally snapped open with a brittle crack. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were several black and white photographs, folded notes, and a small bundle of papers tied with string. The first photograph showed a younger version of his grandfather standing beside two other rangers near the cabin porch. Ethan recognized the same doorway, though back then the boards were straight, the roof solid, and the clearing wider. His grandfather had one hand resting on a rolled map case and the other on the shoulder of a man Ethan did not know. Behind them, the forest rose thick and untouched. Ethan turned the photograph over. Written in faded ink were the words, "Western Patrol, Autumn Survey." Another photograph showed a line of stone markers cutting through the trees. Ethan felt a chill. They looked like the markers he and Noah had found. The papers beneath the photographs were patrol records, written in the same careful handwriting as the journal. Dates, trail conditions, wildlife sightings, blocked roads, damaged markers. At first, the notes seemed ordinary. Then Ethan noticed repeated references to trespassers, fresh axe marks, and survey stakes appearing where they did not belong. One entry mentioned his grandfather confronting a private crew near the western ridge. Another described a formal complaint that had gone unanswered. Ethan read until his eyes ached. The more he learned, the less the cabin felt like an accident. The next morning, Grace returned with a small bundle of firewood balanced in the back of her truck. Ethan met her outside, holding one of the old photographs. Her expression changed the moment she saw it. "Where did you get that?" she asked. He told her about the metal box. Grace took the photograph carefully, as if it might break in her hands. "That was your grandfather," she said softly, "and Ranger Paul Mercer. They patrolled this side of the forest together for years." Ethan asked why the records had been buried. Grace looked toward the western trees before answering. "Your grandfather didn't trust many people near the end." The words landed heavily between them. Inside the cabin, Ethan spread the documents across the table. Grace read in silence, her mouth tightening at certain lines. When she reached an entry about a private crew near the western ridge, she closed her eyes for a moment. "He reported that more than once," she said. "Some people said he imagined trouble where there wasn't any." "Did he?" Ethan asked. Grace shook her hand. "No. He saw what others didn't want to see." Before she could explain further, a truck rolled into the clearing. Victor Sloan stepped out alone this time, carrying no tools, only a folder tucked beneath one arm. His smile was polite but thinner than before. "Morning," he called. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Ethan stepped onto the porch. "You are?" Victor glanced at Grace, then back at Ethan. "I came to improve my offer. This land is hard to maintain, and you've already seen the condition of the cabin. A young man in your position could use real money more than rotting lumber." Ethan felt heat rise in his face. But Grace spoke first. "He's not interested." Victor's eyes remained on Ethan. "I think he can answer for himself." Ethan thought about the rest stop, the cold truck seat, the envelope from foster care, and how easy it would be to take money and leave before this place demanded anything more from him. Then he thought about the photographs on the table and the sentence in the journal. If they move the markers, the forest will disappear. "I'm not selling," he said. Victor's smile vanished for only a second. "Be careful confusing old family sentiment with value." He returned to his truck and drove away without another word. Grace watched the road long after the dust settled. "He wants this place too badly for a worthless cabin," Ethan said. "Yes," Grace replied. "He does." That evening, after Grace left, Ethan returned to the box and untied the final bundle. Beneath several patrol sheets was a folded letter, the paper thin and yellowed. It was addressed to his grandfather. Ethan opened it carefully and read the first lines by lantern light. The writer warned that the official records could no longer be trusted, that the old markers still told the truth, and that everything depended on finding the true boundary. Ethan stopped breathing for a moment. Below that phrase, the rest of the letter had been torn away. Ethan read the torn letter so many times that the words began to blur. But the missing lower half gave him nothing more. The true boundary. It sounded less like a phrase and more like a warning left unfinished. By morning, he had placed the photographs, patrol sheets, and letter inside a dry cabinet, then packed water, a flashlight, the old journal, and a folded copy of the current property map Noah had given him. If his grandfather had written repeatedly about the western line, Ethan needed to see where that line led. The air was cold when he stepped beyond the clearing. At first, there was no path at all, only wet grass, fallen branches, and thick brush that caught at his sleeves. Then, near the second stone marker, he noticed a narrow depression in the ground where leaves settled differently. It curved between two pines and disappeared into the deeper woods. Ethan followed it slowly. The trail had been forgotten, but not erased. In places, old logs blocked the way, and thorny vines forced him to detour. Once, his boot slipped on moss-covered stone, sending him hard to one knee. Pain shot up his leg, but he stayed still until it faded. The forest felt larger here, quieter, older than the clearing around the cabin. Every few hundred steps, he found signs that someone had once maintained this route. A cut branch healed over with age, a flat stone placed across a muddy dip, a faded orange mark on bark. By late morning, he reached a shallow creek. On the far bank stood a boulder with 3 small notches carved into its side. Ethan crouched and brushed away lichen. The marks were too clean to be natural. He pulled out his phone and photographed them, then compared the creek to the current map. According to the map, the property line should have turned long before this point. Yet the trail, the painted trees, and the stone markers all continued west. He sat on the boulder and ate one of the apples Grace had brought the day before, feeling the weight of being alone settle around him. This was the kind of place where a person could disappear without meaning to. He was tightening the cap on his water bottle when he heard a voice behind him. "You're farther out than most first-timers make it." Ethan turned quickly. Grace stood several yards away with a walking stick in one hand and a canvas pack over one shoulder. She looked unsurprised to find him there. "I saw your tracks past the clearing," she said. "Figured you were following the old patrol trail." Ethan exhaled, half relieved and half embarrassed. "You knew it was here?" "I walked it for years." She stepped beside the boulder and touched the carved notches. "So did your grandfather." They continued together, Grace setting a steady pace. She pointed out small signs Ethan would have missed, old blaze marks nearly swallowed by bark, a drainage ditch filled with leaves, stones placed at angles that matched the line of travel. After a while, Ethan asked why the trail had been abandoned. Grace took a long moment before answering. "There were logging disputes years ago. Private crews wanted access to timber near the western ridge. Most people thought it was harmless. A few trees here, a few there. Your grandfather didn't." "Because of the markers?" Ethan asked. "Because he believed the wrong land was being claimed." Grace stopped beside a massive pine with a faint scar running down its trunk. "He said the old boundary protected more forest than the newer maps showed. People got tired of hearing it. Some called him stubborn. Some called him confused." Ethan looked at her. "What did you call him?" Her face softened. "Right." The answer was quiet, but it stayed with him. For the first time since arriving, Ethan felt less like he was chasing scraps of someone else's obsession, and more like he was walking beside a memory others had tried to bury. The trail climbed through denser timber until the ground grew rocky. Ethan's injured knee ached, and his hands were scratched from pushing through brush. Grace advised turning back soon, but he asked for one more bend. Just beyond it, the trees opened into a narrow shelf of land overlooking a deep green valley. Wind moved through the pines with a low, steady sound. At the edge of the shelf, half covered by roots and soil, stood another stone marker. This one was taller than the others, its top flat and its carved symbol clear despite the years. Ethan checked the current map with trembling hands. No marker was listed there. No boundary line touched this point. Grace stood silently beside him as Ethan brushed dirt from the stone and uncovered a second carving near its base. The same circled R, followed by a faint arrow pointing west. Ethan and Grace marked the location of the unlisted stone with a strip of cloth torn from Ethan's sleeve before starting back toward the cabin. Neither of them spoke much on the return walk. The arrow carved beneath the circled R seemed to follow Ethan through the trees, pointing toward something the current map refused to admit existed. By the time they reached the clearing, Noah Briggs was waiting beside his ranger truck with a folder under one arm. "I found the first set of records," he said, "and they don't make this easier." Inside the cabin, Ethan cleared the kitchen table. Noah spread out copies of the current property survey, a forest boundary map, and several pages from county records. Grace stood near the window while Ethan placed his grandfather's journal beside them. The current documents showed a clean boundary running east of the old markers, leaving the western ridge outside Ethan's inherited land and close to areas Sloan Timber had requested access to. Noah tapped the line with his finger. This is the version everyone uses now. Ethan pointed to the trail they had walked. But the markers keep going west. That's the problem, Noah said. Officially, they shouldn't. He had also found references to an earlier survey, but the original map was not in the ranger station archive. Only summaries remained, and those summaries did not match the modern documents exactly. Some acreage numbers were different. A creek had been named in one record but ignored in another. A ridge line had shifted without explanation. Noah admitted he could not accuse anyone of wrongdoing from that alone, but his voice made it clear he was concerned. Ethan opened the journal to the passage about the forest disappearing. My grandfather knew something was wrong. Grace finally spoke. He tried to make people listen. Noah looked at her. You remember that? She nodded slowly. I was young, but I remember the arguments. Old crews, countymen, timber representatives. Your grandfather kept saying the filed map did not match the land. Ethan looked from Grace to Noah. So where is the earlier map? Noah sighed. There may be one person who knows. That afternoon, they drove to a small house outside town where Martha Ellis, a retired county clerk, lived behind a white fence crowded with rose bushes. She was 72, sharp-eyed, and unimpressed by Noah's badge until he mentioned Ethan's grandfather. Then her expression changed. I wondered if that cabin would ever bring someone here, she said. In her back room, filing boxes lined the walls. Martha had kept copies of old public documents that were nearly thrown out when the county office moved buildings years earlier. She searched through brittle folders until she found a thin packet labeled with the forest district number. Inside were ledger pages and a small index card referencing a boundary correction from decades ago. Correction, Ethan repeated. Is that normal? Martha adjusted her glasses. Sometimes, but this one was argued over. She remembered his grandfather coming to the office more than once, asking to see the original survey. He was polite, she said, but determined. The county later filed a revised version, and the older material became difficult to locate. Difficult? Noah asked. Martha's mouth tightened. Misplaced is the word they used. She let Ethan photograph the ledger pages. One acreage total was larger than the current record by a number that made Noah whistle softly. Martha also produced a faded copy of a map fragment. It showed only part of the western area, but the creek, ridge, and several markers aligned with what Ethan and Grace had found on foot. Ethan felt his chest tighten. The land itself had been telling the truth. When they returned to town, Victor Sloan was waiting near the ranger station parking lot. He approached Noah first, smiling as if their meeting were coincidence. Ranger Briggs, I hope the young man isn't being encouraged to misunderstand old paperwork. Noah kept his tone professional. We're reviewing historical records. Victor turned to Ethan. Old maps can confuse people. Lines change. Land gets corrected. That's why official records matter. Then you shouldn't mind us checking them, Ethan said. Victor's eyes hardened for only a moment. Just don't waste your life defending a mistake your grandfather refused to let go. He left before Ethan could answer. Back at the cabin, near dusk, Ethan spread Martha's copies beside the journal. The torn letter, the patrol notes, the unlisted markers, and the fragment all pointed west. Yet the final proof was still missing. He searched the journal again, slower this time, page by page. Near the back, beneath a loose flap of leather in the cover, his fingers touched a folded scrap he had missed before. The handwriting was his grandfather's. One line stood alone. If the records fail, The last proof is where stone guards the cabin. Ethan stared at the sentence until the lantern light began to tremble in his hand. If the records fail, the last proof is where stone guards the cabin. Outside, the forest had gone dark, and every sound beyond the wall seemed louder than before. He wanted to search immediately, but the cold and the darkness made the clearing feel unfamiliar, almost watchful. Instead, he tucked the scrap beneath the journal cover again and placed the documents in the cabinet where he had stored the metal box. For the first time since arriving, he slid the broken chair beneath the front door handle before lying down. Sleep came badly. Near dawn, a sharp crack woke him. Ethan sat upright, listening. Another sound followed, softer this time, like wood shifting under weight. He grabbed the flashlight and stepped into the main room. The front door stood open. The chair had been shoved aside. Cold air moved through the cabin, carrying the smell of damp leaves. Ethan's heart pounded as he swept the flashlight across the room. Drawers hung open. The cabinet doors had been pulled wide. The metal box lay on the floor, empty except for one photograph that had slipped beneath the table. The patrol sheets were gone. Martha's copies were gone. The torn letter was gone. Ethan checked the journal with shaking hands and felt a thin breath of relief when he found it still hidden beneath a loose floorboard where he had placed it before sleeping. Whoever entered had searched fast, but not carefully enough. At sunrise, he walked to Grace's place because his phone had no signal near the cabin. She opened the door before he knocked twice, and her face changed when she saw him. "Someone got in," Ethan said. Grace drove back with him without asking unnecessary questions. She examined the forced door, the scattered drawers, and the empty cabinet. Her jaw tightened. "They knew what to look for." Ethan held up the journal. "Not everything." Grace looked at it, then at him, and something like guilt crossed her face. "Your grandfather used to hide papers in different places. He said no single drawer should hold the truth." Ethan remembered the sentence in the cover, "Where stone guards the cabin." Do you know what that means? Grace turned toward the back window, where the old stone wall curved along the edge of the clearing. For several seconds, she said nothing. "I hoped you would not have to ask me that." Ethan waited. Grace lowered herself into a chair, her hands folded tightly around the head of her walking stick. "Before he died, your grandfather made me promise something. If anyone ever came asking about the Western Line, I was to tell them nothing unless they found his own words first. He didn't want curiosity leading the wrong person to what he protected." "And now?" Ethan asked. "Now someone has broken into your home looking for it." The word home struck Ethan harder than he expected. The cabin was still drafty, damaged, and nearly empty. But hearing Grace call it his made the violation feel deeper. She continued quietly. He believed the final proof was hidden where no official would think to search, and no thief would bother to dig without knowing the exact place. Ethan looked toward the wall again. It was built of heavy field stones, stacked behind the cabin in a low curve that separated the clearing from the darker trees. Moss filled its cracks. Ferns grew along its base. He had barely noticed it except as part of the landscape. Grace stood. "There is something I should have told you sooner. Your grandfather rebuilt that wall himself after the survey arguments began. Stone by stone. He said it needed to last longer than paper." Ethan felt anger rise, not at her exactly, but at the years of silence surrounding him. "Why didn't anyone tell me who he was?" Grace's expression softened. "Because by the time you were born, most people had decided his story was too troublesome to remember. And because you were a child, no one thought would ever come back here. The truth hurt because it sounded possible. Ethan looked around the ruined room, at the broken door and the empty cabinet, and for a moment he felt 18 again in the worst way. Too young, too alone, too late to matter. Grace reached across the table and placed the remaining photograph in front of him. It showed his grandfather by the cabin, strong-backed and serious, one hand resting on the porch rail. "He mattered," she said, "and whether you wanted it or not, what he protected has come to you." Outside, tire tracks marked the soft ground near the road, but rain from the night before had blurred them beyond use. Ethan repaired the door as best he could, then carried the journal, the photograph, and the scrap of paper outside. Grace walked with him behind the cabin. The stone wall waited in the gray morning light, quiet and ordinary. Yet Ethan now saw how carefully it had been built. At its center, 3 larger stones formed a narrow arch shape unlike the rest of the wall. Grace pointed with her walking stick. "Start there," text. Ethan set the journal carefully on the porch before kneeling beside the section of wall Grace had indicated. Up close, the 3 larger stones were fitted together more precisely than the others. Moss filled the seams, hiding narrow gaps that looked untouched for decades. He slipped the blade of an old pry bar beneath the first stone and pushed with all his weight. Nothing moved. Grace knelt beside him without a word and began clearing away dirt packed along the base. Together they loosened the earth until Ethan tried again. This time, the stone shifted with a deep grinding sound. They lifted it aside and exposed a dark cavity behind the wall. It was barely large enough to hold a small chest, yet only one object rested inside. A long metal tube, sealed at both ends and coated in wax, lay on 2 flat stones above the damp soil. Ethan reached in carefully and lifted it free. Though dusty, the tube showed almost no rust. His grandfather had prepared it to survive. Grace stared at it without speaking. "He found a way," she whispered. Ethan brushed dirt from the surface. There were no words, only a small stamped symbol, the same circled R carved into the old survey markers. Before he could examine it further, the sound of an engine drifted across the clearing. A pickup truck stopped near the road. Victor Sloan stepped out alone, closing the door with deliberate calm. His eyes moved immediately to the open section of the wall and then to the tube in Ethan's hands. "So," Victor said quietly, "you finally found it." Ethan instinctively stepped backward. Grace moved between them. "This is private property." Victor ignored her. "Your grandfather wasted half his life chasing stories that should have been left alone. Don't make the same mistake." Ethan tightened his grip on the tube. "You knew something was hidden here." Victor sighed. "I knew your grandfather believed it was important. That's different." He took one slow step forward. "Whatever is inside belongs in the proper hands. Give it to me, and this ends today." Grace answered before Ethan could. "No, it ends when the truth comes out." Victor's polite expression faded. "Truth," he repeated. "Old papers don't change modern law." Ethan remembered the missing patrol records, the broken door, and the empty cabinet. "Then why were people searching my cabin?" Victor did not answer. Instead, his gaze remained fixed on the tube. The silence itself felt like an answer. Ethan slowly backed toward the porch. "I'm not handing this over." Victor folded his arms. "You don't even know how to open it." Ethan looked at the ends of the tube. Both caps were solid brass. One end contained a narrow keyhole, almost hidden beneath dried wax. He had missed it until now. Grace noticed it as well. "Your grandfather planned for this," she said softly. Victor's patience finally broke. "Think carefully," he said. "You have no idea what you're carrying." Ethan did not wait to hear more. Clutching the tube beneath one arm, he hurried through the cabin, grabbed the journal from the porch table, and exited through the back door before Victor could circle the house. Grace followed close behind. They crossed the clearing and disappeared into the trees along the old patrol trail. Branches brushed against Ethan's shoulders as he ran. His lungs burned, but he refused to slow until the cabin could no longer be seen through the pines. Only then did they stop beside the first stone marker. Grace leaned against her walking stick, catching her breath. "He wasn't chasing the cabin," Ethan said. "He was chasing this." Grace nodded. "Always." Ethan examined the brass keyhole again. It was far too small for any ordinary key. He searched the outside of the tube for another clue, but found none. The wax seal remained unbroken. Whatever rested inside had waited half a century. It could wait one more day if necessary. They returned cautiously after sunset. Victor and his truck were gone, leaving only tire tracks in the soft ground. Ethan hid the metal tube beneath a loose floorboard in the bedroom while keeping the journal with him. Later, sitting alone at the kitchen table, he turned the tube once more beneath the lantern light. The tiny lock caught the glow. It was beautifully made, simple but precise, as though its builder had expected someone patient enough to earn the right to open it. Ethan searched every cabinet and drawer for a matching key without success. Then he remembered the countless repairs his grandfather had made throughout the cabin and the habit of hiding important things where no stranger would think to look. Grace studied the lock one final time before leaving for the night. "Your grandfather never carried unnecessary keys," she said. "If he expected someone to open that tube one day, the key is still here." Ethan rested his hand on the weathered kitchen table, his eyes moving slowly across the room until they settled on the old wooden furniture his grandfather had built himself. Somewhere inside the cabin, the final key was waiting. Ethan began with the kitchen table because his hand had landed there when Grace mentioned the key. It was heavy, scarred, and plainly handmade, built from thick planks that still held the faint smell of pine when he leaned close. His grandfather had left marks everywhere, uneven sanding beneath the edges, old knife cuts near one corner, a burn mark where a hot pan must have been set down years before. Ethan turned it on its side and checked beneath the top, then the cross braces, then each leg. Nothing appeared except dust and a dead spider. Frustration tightened in his chest. The metal tube lay under the loose bedroom floorboard, sealed and waiting, while every passing hour gave Victor more time to return. Ethan forced himself to slow down. His grandfather had hidden the journal scrap beneath leather, the tube behind stone, the box beneath roots. He did not hide things carelessly. Ethan ran his fingers along each table leg again. One felt slightly different, heavier near the bottom. He dragged the lantern closer and noticed a narrow seam disguised by dirt. Using his pocket knife, he scraped carefully around it until a round, wooden plug loosened from the base. It fell into his palm, and something tiny slid after it with a soft, metallic click. Ethan froze. Resting on the floor was a small brass key, darkened with age but clean where it had been protected inside the wood. His breath caught in his throat. For a moment, he could only stare at it. Then he picked it up and carried it to the bedroom, where he lifted the floorboard and pulled out the tube. His hands shook as he fitted the key into the lock. It resisted at first, then turned with a quiet snap. The brass cap loosened. Ethan broke the wax seal and slid out a rolled sheet wrapped in thin cloth. He expected one complete map. Instead, only a large, torn section emerged, its edges carefully cut, its lines faded but still readable. The paper showed the western ridge, the creek, and a chain of marked stones, including several Ethan had already seen. In one corner, the circled R appeared beside handwritten survey notes. Across the top, in his grandfather's writing, were the words, "Original boundary, western section." Ethan felt both triumph and disappointment at once. It was proof, but not all of it. The cabin, the stones, the journal, and Martha's fragment suddenly felt like pieces of a broken thing waiting to be assembled. He did not sleep. At first light, he drove to Grace's house with the map section wrapped beneath his jacket. She opened the door holding coffee, took one look at his face, and set the cup down untouched. When he showed her the brass key, her eyes filled before she could speak. "He trusted someone would find it," she said. Together, they called Noah from Grace's landline by mid-morning. Noah arrived with copies of Martha's fragment and the current survey documents. They spread everything across Grace's dining table, weighing the corners with mugs and books. Ethan placed the newly opened map section beside Martha's faded fragment. The creek lines matched. The ridge marks matched. The old stone symbols aligned almost perfectly. Noah leaned closer, tracing the route with one finger. "This isn't random," he said. "It's the same survey." Ethan pointed to the cut edge of his grandfather's map. "But the rest is missing." Noah nodded. "Maybe, but even this shows the western boundary ran farther out than the current record." Grace brought the journal and opened it to the entries about patrol routes and moved markers. Ethan added the photographs showing his grandfather and Ranger Paul Mercer near the cabin and along the stone line. The documents no longer felt like separate clues. They spoke to one another. A patrol note mentioned the creek crossing. Martha's ledger listed acreage larger than the modern file. The map section showed a line that followed the old markers Ethan and Grace had walked. Noah photographed every piece with care. "I need to compare this with the official county copies," he said. "But Ethan, this could be enough to reopen the boundary record." Ethan heard the caution in his voice. "Could be." Noah looked at him honestly. "The strongest proof would be the full original survey. This is a section, a powerful section, but still part of something larger." The words stung, though Ethan knew they were fair. He had wanted the tube to answer everything. Instead, it had given them a door to push open, not the whole room beyond it. Grace touched the edge of the map. "Your grandfather may have separated the proof on purpose." Noah compared the map section with Martha's fragment again. Then his posture changed. He pulled the modern map closer and drew a pencil line over the old marker's route, from the cabin stones to the ridge and beyond. The line ran straight through land now treated as available timber access. It also enclosed a much larger section of forest than the modern boundary allowed. Ethan saw it at the same time Noah did. The issue was no longer whether a few stones had been moved or whether an old man had misremembered a trail. The old line changed everything. Noah looked from the map to Ethan, his voice low. "The most important part isn't what was hidden in the tube." He tapped the western edge where the old line broke against the missing section. "It's where this boundary was changed." Noah filed the request before noon, attaching photographs of the map section, Martha's ledger pages, the patrol notes Ethan had copied before the break-in, and the images of the old survey markers still standing in the forest. By evening, the county office had called Martha for confirmation, and the ranger district had asked Noah to bring the original documents in person. Ethan rode with him the next morning, the metal tube wrapped in cloth across his lap. Grace sat in the back seat, quiet but steady, as if she had been waiting years for this drive. In the county records room, under bright lights that made every stain and crease visible, the map section was placed beside Martha's fragment and the current survey. Officials spoke carefully at first, using words like inconsistency and historical discrepancy. But their faces changed as the lines began to match. The creek, the ridge, the circled R markers, the acreage difference, and the Western Patrol notes all pointed to the same truth. The boundary had not simply changed over time. It had been moved on paper, while the old stones remained in the ground. Noah walked them through each marker Ethan had found. From the cabin clearing to the ridge shelf, Martha confirmed the old correction had always troubled her, especially when the original survey disappeared from public files. Grace described the arguments she remembered, the pressure placed on Ethan's grandfather, and the way people had dismissed him when he refused to stop asking questions. Ethan said little at first. He watched strangers study the life of a man he had never met and slowly realize that the old ranger had not been confused, bitter, or stubborn for no reason. He had been protecting proof. Victor Sloan arrived halfway through the review, wearing a dark coat and a controlled expression. He claimed his company had relied only on official records and denied knowing anything about stolen documents or hidden maps. But when Noah mentioned the break-in and the offer to buy the cabin, Victor's confidence thinned. The officials did not accuse him in that room, but they suspended the timber access request immediately while opening a formal boundary review. For Ethan, the decision felt unreal. It was not dramatic, no one shouted, no one confessed. A clerk simply stamped a notice, and the land that had seemed defenseless the day before was suddenly protected by process, witnesses, and paper. Over the next several weeks, survey crews returned to the forest. Ethan walked with them when they reached the cabin, carrying his grandfather's journal in his pack. They measured the stones, photographed the carvings, and followed the old line through the trees. Each marker confirmed more of the hidden map. The corrected boundary enclosed the western ridge and thousands of untouched trees that Sloan Timber had hoped to reach. When the county finally recognized the old survey as legitimate historical evidence, the timber plan collapsed. Victor's company withdrew its claim without ceremony. To the town, it became a story about records and land. To Ethan, it was something smaller and heavier. His grandfather had bought a forgotten ranger cabin for $200 because owning that one poor piece of ground meant he could guard the place where the truth was hidden. He had not kept the cabin because it was valuable. He had kept it because it stood at the edge of a promise. Spring came slowly to the clearing. Ethan repaired the porch first, using salvaged lumber and help from Noah on weekends. Grace taught him which boards could be saved and which had to be replaced before they betrayed him underfoot. The broken windows were covered, then fixed. The front door was rehung properly. The stone wall behind the cabin was rebuilt, but the hollow section remained marked with a small brass plate listing his grandfather's name and the words, "He kept the line." Ethan did not turn the cabin into a business. He did something quieter. With Noah's approval and Grace's help, he opened it one Saturday each month for school groups, hikers, and local families who wanted to learn how the old rangers protected the forest before satellites and digital maps. Martha donated copies of the restored records. Noah arranged a small display about boundary markers. Grace placed the old photograph of Ethan's grandfather on the wall beside the door. Ethan added the journal beneath glass, open to the page that read, "If they move the the markers. The forest will disappear. The first time children stood around the table asking why someone would hide a map in a wall. Ethan struggled to answer. Finally, he said, "Because sometimes the truth needs someone patient enough to protect it." Grace smiled from the doorway, and Ethan knew he had said enough. By late summer, the cabin no longer looked abandoned. It still leaned slightly in one corner, and the floorboards still creaked in cold weather. But it had warmth again. People who once called it worthless began stopping by with tools, old photographs, and stories about the ranger who had refused to give up. Ethan listened to all of them, piece by piece. They gave him back parts of a family he had thought he never had. He kept the metal tube on a shelf above the table, empty now, its purpose fulfilled. Sometimes, when the clearing grew quiet, he imagined his grandfather walking the Western Trail alone, checking stones no one else believed mattered. Ethan wished they could have met. He wished he could have asked why the old man had not come for him sooner, why life had left them separated until only papers and walls remained. But grief no longer felt like an empty room. It felt like a path through trees, marked carefully enough that someone lost could still find the way. On the anniversary of the day he arrived, Ethan stood behind the cabin at sunset. The repaired stone wall glowed gold in the fading light. Beyond it, the forest stretched toward the ridge, following the true boundary at last. Noah had gone back to the station. Grace had driven home before dark. The clearing was quiet except for wind moving through the pines. Ethan closed the cabin door and rested his hand against the frame where he had first heard that strange, metallic echo. Back then, he had been homeless, frightened, and certain the world had given him nothing but another ruin. Now he understood. He had inherited more than a cabin. He had inherited a duty, a name, and a place that had waited for him. As the sun disappeared behind the western trees, Ethan looked out across the land his grandfather had saved and, for the first time in his life, felt he had truly come home.